Welcome, everyone. My name is Dr. Laura Cohen, and I'm the Executive Director of the Harriet and Kenneth Kupferberg Holocaust Center at Queensborough Community College at the City University of New York. Our mission is to use the lessons of the Holocaust to educate current and future generations about the ramifications of prejudice, racism, and stereotyping. Today's talk, Decolonizing Design and Cultural Symbols, features Darienne Turner, who is the Assistant Curator of Indigenous Art of the Americas at the Baltimore Museum of Art and a faculty member at the Maryland Institute College of Art. The Kupferberg Holocaust Center in Bayside, New York is situated on the traditional land of the Mentinecock people who continue to live here today. We offer gratitude and respect to all of the Indigenous people of Turtle Island, past, present, and future, including the Lenape and Shinnecock peoples. What I just read is what we call a land acknowledgement. This is a statement recognizing that the land we all occupy in the course of our daily lives, including our schools, jobs, parks, and homes, as well as the names of towns and roads, was first inhabited by another group of people who were forcibly expelled and murdered. Today, we identify those crimes for what they are: mass atrocities and genocide. These horrors continue to have devastating political, social, economic, and environmental impacts upon and within Native American and Indigenous communities. Today's program is a collaboration between the Kupferberg Holocaust Center and the Museum and Gallery Studies program in the Art and Design Department at Queensborough Community College. It builds upon the KHC's longstanding tradition of connecting core themes within both Holocaust and human rights education, of erasure and tragedy, of visibility and resilience, with how they are expressed and taught within and at museums and education centers. Our event is co-sponsored by the Museum Studies MA program at CUNY School of Professional Studies, the Ray Walpole Institute at Western Washington University, the Holocaust, Genocide, and Interfaith Education Center at Manhattan College, the Center for Holocaust and Genocide Education at St. Elizabeth University, and the Center for the Study of Genocide and Human Rights at Rutgers University. After the presentation, please be sure to submit your questions via the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. And now to kick things off, please join me in welcoming Kat Griffin, Program Coordinator and Faculty Member in the Gallery and Museum Studies Program at Queensborough Community College and Faculty Member of Museum Studies at CUNY School of Professional Studies. Kat, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Dr. Laura Cohen, for your warm welcome and introduction. Thank you also to Associate Director Marissa Hollywood for her work on this program as well, and to the Art and Design Department, Anne Marie Coffey, Kenneth Powell, and our Chair, Kathleen Wentrek, for their ongoing support. As Laura mentioned, I am faculty member and program coordinator of the Gallery Museum Studies program at Queensborough Community College. Our program, I'll mention briefly, is the only associate's degree in the discipline offered in CUNY, making it a uniquely affordable entry point into our field in this whole region. I'm happy to share my email in the chat for those who would like to know more about the program. I also, as a faculty member of the CUNY SPS Museum Studies MA program, I want to thank Jenna Copeland for their support for this program as well. Hello to all of my students and all of the many students and community members who are here today. We welcome and look forward to your contributions to the Q&A portion of the program. And this program, as Laura mentioned, is one of a series of yearly events, Human Rights and the Museum, which comes out of really a living land acknowledgement on the part of the Kupferberg Holocaust Center, which resulted from the Native American Survivance project at the KHC, which took the form of a colloquium, exhibition, and publication starting in 2018. For this reason, Indigenous voices and viewpoints are centered in many of the program series, as is the case today. You can also find many prior programs on the KHC's website and on their YouTube if you're interested to explore other topics in our series. Now for today's event, Decolonizing Design and Cultural Symbols. As Laura alluded to, this event comes out of ongoing conversations around exhibitions and programs between the KHC staff, community, and QCC students regarding prominent symbols and insignias and how their meanings can change and shift over time in accordance to how, where, and by whom they are presented. We have discussed, for example, in the past and in programs and in exhibitions, how the pink triangle, which was initially employed as a badge of shame by the Nazi Party to designate gay men in concentration camps, has been reclaimed since by GLBTQI communities as a symbol of queer liberation. In fact, in 1972, it was a survivor of a camp that brought the symbol to a broader public through his memoir. And in the 1980s, that we see the triangle combined with the text, "Silence equals death," to speak to the US government's inaction in the face of the AIDS crisis. More recently, we see the pink triangle utilized in Holocaust memorials as well. So in recent years, various KHC programs have addressed this specific topic and other examples of how symbols and design elements can play a role in both oppression and in resistance. Certainly, the students who are here today who are engaging in art and design courses, art history, gallery and museum studies, have been learning through making and through research and through writing how the same symbol can often signify different things to different communities. In today's program, we will learn more about one specific community and possibly the most ubiquitous symbol on this continent and how it came to be used in new and somewhat surprising ways. With that very brief intro, I'm pleased to introduce our esteemed speaker, Darienne Turner, who is an enrolled member of the Yurok Tribe of California, Assistant Curator of Indigenous Art at the Baltimore Art Museum, Indigenous Art of the Americas at the Baltimore Art Museum, and faculty member at MICA, where she teaches decolonizing design. She was educated at Stanford University, Barge Graduate Center, and her work engages intersections of indigeneity, art, and design. In her role at the BMA, she has curated Arctic Artistry, which is currently on view through May 2023. In the chat, you'll see a link shortly to information on that exhibition. Of course, we encourage folks to visit. She also curated 2021 collection installation of artworks from the ancient Americas. And today she will be discussing her 2020 exhibition, Stripes and Stars, Reclaiming Lakota Independence. She has also contributed to exhibitions at the Bard Graduate Center, Walther Arts Museum, the Utah Museum of Fine Arts, and the Yellowstone National Park. I am very pleased to hand the Zoom to Dare, and I look forward to our conversation following her presentation.
Thank you so much for that warm welcome. I'm really happy to be with you all today. I'm going to share my screen and let me know if this, I think it looks okay, but interrupt me if it doesn't. So as everybody has already said, my name is Darienne Turner. I'm a member of the Yurok Tribe of California. I teach at Maryland Institute College of Art, and also I'm a curator at the BMA. And today my talk is going to share some of my recent work at the museum, specifically focusing on this show, Stripes and Stars, Reclaiming Lakota Independence. My talk and much of my research interrogates the relationship between Indigenous people and the United States government. With this exhibition, Stripes and Stars, Reclaiming Lakota Independence, I ask really questions around identity. But before I dive into that, I wanted to do a quick little land acknowledgement of my own because I'm coming to you from Baltimore. I'm located in Baltimore on the ancestral and unceded lands of the Piscataway and Susquehannock tribes. I recognize the lasting presence of Indigenous peoples in this region and acknowledge the broken promises and treaties, as well as the history of oppression that those people experienced and continue to experience to this day. Though a statement does not adequately address the history of dispossession, it's a step we can take to honor and acknowledge the way that Indigenous peoples have stewarded the land for generations. So this practice of doing a land acknowledgement is important because it highlights the role that Native Americans have played historically in this country. And we're going to be thinking about that throughout the course of this whole talk. You have heard similar statements before, right before me. I'm sure you've heard them at other events, and I hope that you'll continue to hear them in the future. But after this lecture, take a moment, we're all on Zoom, we're all in different places. I invite you to take a moment to reflect on the history of the land that you currently occupy. And if you don't know whose land this used to be, a good resource is native-land.ca. That's a really cool interactive map. And it's a resource you can begin to explore to think about the history of ownership or stewardship of land. I will say it's not 100% comprehensive or accurate, but it's a great leaping off place. So let's talk about Lakota art. With my exhibition, I asked two principal questions. One was, what does the American flag represent? And the other was, who does it represent? And I think that second question is more important. So this most patriotic symbol of the United States is seen across countless iconic American artworks, including works by people of color who historically have not been well served by the government for which it stands. The flag's appearance in artworks can serve a straightforward aggrandizing purpose meant to glorify the state, or it can serve a more subversive or hidden agenda. Representations of the flag shift over time and place, and it means different things to different audiences. On the left, we see a work in the BMA's collection, Whitfield Lovell's Deuce. And on the right, we see the flag being employed by the artist Faith Ringgold in her work, Freedom of Speech. Both of these works were made by people of color who superimpose images and language onto the flag in order to send a message about who does and who does not benefit from what the flag represents. And let's take a trip back in time and look at some other instances where we see Native or flags depicted in artwork. Here we see a work also in the BMA's collection, Bicentennial Indian, by the artist Fritz Scholder, who is Native. And the artist made this work in 1975 in conjunction with the National Bicentennial celebrations to take place the following year. Here, a Native American man is wearing regalia from prior centuries, and he holds a flag in his lap along with an eagle feather in his hand that reflects the lasting presence of Native people on the continent. And I love looking to the words of artists to get a better sense of where they're coming from. And I felt that this quote is really, it really illuminates Scholder's perspective. So here we go. He said, quote, people don't really like Indians. Oh, they like their own conceptions of the Indian, usually the Plains Indian, romantic and noble and handsome, and somehow the embodiment of wisdom and patience. But Indians in America are usually poor, sometimes derelicts outside the value system, living in uncomfortable surroundings. And we have really been viewed as something other than human beings by larger society. End quote. This depiction here of a Native man rejects the historical erasure of Native peoples and highlights the ways in which they have interfaced with white Americans for centuries. I'm going to show you another work. This one's in the Met's collection, and this probably looks familiar, Washington Crossing the Delaware by Emmanuel Leutz. And this really drives home how the flag has been a dynamic symbol against which artists could continually reevaluate what it means to be American. This piece represents a myth that cuts to the core of American identity. And the events here depicted here is the lead up to one of Washington's most important victories. And while that's interesting, I find the person at the back of the boat the most interesting feature of all. There we see a man who is wearing moccasins and sporting a traditional Native shoulder pouch. And in an interpretation of the work, the Mohawk scholar and artist Alan Michelson claims that this man was most likely meant to represent a Native member within Washington's troops. Michelson said, quote, Native Americans warriors fought often decisively on both sides of the war, British and American, according to their nation's interests. In 1778, the United States signed a treaty with the Lenape or Delaware people, its first formal treaty with an indigenous nation, securing assistance and safe passage through Delaware land in exchange for articles of clothing, utensils, and implements of war. The treaty recognized Delaware sovereignty, guaranteed territorial rights, and offered the possibility of indigenous statehood. But soon a double crossing of the Delaware took place. Persistent treaty violations by settlers and the US government culminated in a major massacre in 1782, end quote. The flag is a performance of national permanence, suggesting a monolithic symbol of a people and a place. But the history of the flag and our relationship to it over the life of the American nation has been as dynamic and multifaceted as American identity itself. And that brings me to two works from the BMA's collection. We see a girl's bonnet on the left and a boy's vest on the right. And these are both made by Lakota artists in the late 19th century. So when I first saw these in storage, I was like totally baffled. I questioned why a Lakota artist in the late 1800s would put such a symbol on their work. Because that period of time for this Native group located in North and South Dakota was incredibly difficult. They had a very rocky relationship with the US government, who had recently taken their freedom to roam the plains, practice their own religion, hunt buffalo, and pursue traditional life ways. And the government had forced them into life on the reservation, which was not compatible at all with their life ways. However, despite the US government's attempts, the Lakota were not wholly stripped of their heritage throughout this all. Lakota women continued artistic traditions, and they began to incorporate images of the American flag and other patriotic iconography into traditional beadwork designs. This was a means of negotiating the Lakota people's relationship to the US government, and it was a way to assert their own culture. The presence of the flag in such works like these peaked between around 1880 and 1900, and that was the same period that the US government passed the Code of Indian Offenses, which formally outlawed important cultural practices like ceremonial dances, puberty rites, and even speaking the Lakota language. So that gives you a sense of what was happening at that time. And throughout all of this, stripes and stars were shifting symbols. The flag reflected the Lakota people's future and acted as a tool to preserve their traditions in a changing world. So let's speak briefly about the historical context that these works emerged from, which is reflected in this GIF scene here. This comes from an interactive website called The Invasion of America, which is a project directed by Claudio Sant, a professor of history at the University of Georgia. It reveals how between 1776 and 1887, the United States government seized over 1.5 billion acres, billion with a B, from America's indigenous people through either treaty or executive order. And the word treaty is problematic for a lot of reasons, because they were often broken or signed under, people were coerced into signing them. So that's not an incredibly accurate term, but that is how we can understand it. So this is a reflection of how the 19th century was a period of profound trauma and immense transformation for Native people specifically located in the plains in the center there. The concept of manifest destiny and the unrelenting need for resources encouraged white settlers to claim territories and encroach on Native-held lands throughout central United States. Treaties were brokered and then broken in quick measure. Reservations were established and then dismembered within a few short years. So you can actually see the Lakota Reservation here in, if you know where North and South Dakota are, we're going to see it pop up briefly here. And oh, there's a moment where it chops all apart. So we'll take a closer look at that in a moment. But first, let's talk through some highlights of a timeline. So this breaks down some of the most important events that shaped Lakota lifeways in the 19th century. We're going to look at this overall picture now and then think about it in conjunction with either specific events or artworks on subsequent slides. So we start off with the American Civil War, 1861 to 65. And this is important because it trained up several of the men who led the charge against natives in the so-called Plains Indians War. For instance, George Custer. 1868 was an important year. The Treaty of Fort Laramie established the Great Sioux Reservation that guaranteed the tribe the sacred Black Hills. 1868, a Washita massacre took place in which over 100 Cheyenne people were murdered. And that was a moment where George Custer came into his own. He brought his troops. They were supposed to just kill warriors, but they killed women and children, and they kept some as hostages as well. inevitably killing them all. So that gives you a taste of George Custer. Then in 1869, we have the completion of the Union Pacific Railroad. So a lot more settlers are coming through the region. In 1873, we have gold discovered in the Black Hills, and an economic depression hit at the same time. Gold and land were often seen as antidotes to financial problems of this nation. So in a practical sense, that 1873 discovery of gold nullified the 1868 Treaty of Fort Laramie, as white prospectors came into the region and the government said, oh, deal with it, not our problem. In 1876, we have the Battle of Little Bighorn, or also known as Battle of Greasy Grass. In 1887, we have the Dawes Act, which we'll take a look at in a moment, but that converted 2/3 of native held territory into land for white homesteaders. And in 1890, we have the Wounded Knee Massacre. So let's look at some of those in conjunction with this map here. So this is a map of what used to be the Great Sioux Reservation, that large chunk of land that we saw dismembered on that GIF. And if we track some of these events against the loss of land, we see some, not coincidences. First, the pink boundary around the edge is the Great Sioux Reservation that was established with that 1868 Treaty of Fort Laramie. Then with the 1873 economic depression, the U.S. government reevaluated the land and in its value and decided to break from that treaty. And you'll notice the Black Hills on this whole side ended up being lopped out of the native held land. In 1877, just a few years after the gold rush. So those are really closely linked. And this brings us to 1887, when the Dawes Act was passed. And this converted native land that was held collectively into individual parcels of land given to single families through a process called allotment. Then after they allocated all of those individual parcels, they discovered, hey, now we have a surplus. Wonderful. Let's give that over to white homesteaders. And so essentially that turned 2/3, that resulted in the loss of 2/3 of native held territory. And I think it's important to get a sense of, what the identity of Dawes was, to get a sense of, what was the goal, what was the aspiration that he had for Native people. And he is quoted as saying, "The head chief told us there was not a family in the whole nation that had not a home of its own. There was not a pauper in that nation, and the nation did not own a dollar. It built its own capital, and it built its schools and its hospitals. Yet the defect of the system was apparent. They have got as far as they can go because they own land in common. There is no enterprise to make your home any better than that of your neighbors. There is no selfishness, which is at the bottom of civilization. Till this people will consent to give up their own lands and divide them among their citizens so that they can own the land they cultivate, and only then will they make progress." End quote. So it just shows these really warped values that the American nation had in place. It valued selfishness and wanton greed as foundational to the settler American way of life. So Native populations were expected to emulate that like sophisticated behavior, quote unquote. It just gives you a sense of the really incompatibility between Native life ways and the sort of vision of a Native future that the government had. And that brings us to 1889 on this map, where we lose this entire middle section here, where and the Great Sioux Reservation at that point was broken into several separate reservations, including Pine Ridge, Rosebud, Cheyenne River, and Standing Rock. And all of these events reveal the U.S. government's mistreatment of Native Americans and their sovereignty. Again, it's broken treaties and promises, as well as rampant greed disguised as manifest destiny that plagued the 19th century. So I just want to note the next slide has a graphic image. So if you don't want to see it, look away, and I'll let you know when we are off of it. So the final date on the timeline that I wanted to call your attention to was 1890, when the Wounded Knee Massacre took place. And to bring it back to the objects from the BMA's collection, this is the same decade that boy's vest with the American flag and the girl's bonnet with the American flag were created. So it's right around the same time. On December 29th, 1890, U.S. cavalry troops attempted to disarm Lakota men who were camped at the Pine Ridge Reservation. There are several reports that try to describe these events, and they conflict with each other. But one version states that a deaf Lakota man named Black Coyote, when accosted by a white agent, didn't want to just hand over his rifle because he had paid a lot for it and wasn't going to be compensated. And so there was a dispute happening there. And while that was happening, a different elderly man was engaged in a ritual called the ghost dance, which white authorities found very threatening, even though it wasn't meant to be menacing at all. So things are very on edge and tense. And then all of a sudden, Black Coyote's rifle went off. And then the US government began shooting at all the Lakota people from all sides. By the time the massacre was over, more than 250 men, women, and children had been murdered, and 51 were wounded, and later some of those wounded died as well. And despite the circumstances of this slaughter, 20 US soldiers were awarded the Medal of Honor after this event. So it just, again, gives you this really clear take on how warped this perspective was. And let's look, and now we're off that slide, let's look to the words of the Lakota people themselves to get a sense of how they were feeling at this time. So Red Cloud, an Oglala Lakota chief, explained that, quote, "We felt that we were mocked in our misery. We had no newspapers and no one to speak for us. We had no redress. Our rations were again reduced. You who eat 3 times a day and see your children well and happy around you can't understand what starving Indians feel. We were faint with hunger and maddened by despair. We held our dying children and felt their little bodies tremble as their souls went out and left only a dead weight in our hands. They were not very heavy, but we ourselves were very faint, and the dead weighed us down. There was no hope on earth, and God seemed to have forgotten us." So that brings me back to this ultimate question at the heart of this exhibition. So why did the Lakota people depict the ultimate symbol of colonialism and their oppressor, the American flag, in their art? And while that question may seem straightforward enough, the answer is far from simple. It's multi-layered and dependent on the context and the presentation style of the flag. There were 3 major reasons explored in the exhibition. The first relates to images where the flag is meant to communicate something related to military might. Some of the earliest works that were reproduced for the show are ledger drawings. And ledger drawings are named after the paper that was used, which was accounting ledger book paper, which was more readily available than other forms of paper in the 19th century. Native men living on the plains used pencil, ink, and watercolor to draw images related to traditional life, including scenes relating to hunting or ceremonies or warfare, as we see here. During the pre-reservation period, which ran from about 1820 to 1880, the American flag was often seen in ledger art as a reflection of the opposing force on the battlefield. We also see Lakota warriors taking it as a prize to demonstrate their military prowess. So in this self-portrait, an Oglala warrior named Sitting Bull wields the American flag like a coup stick, or a weapon intended to touch the enemy without killing him. Historically, any blow against an enemy counted as a coup, but the most prestigious acts include touching the enemy with a hand, a bow, or a coup stick and escaping unharmed. And that really showed that if you were able to do that, you had a lot of power and prestige in battle. And it was a traditional way of showing bravery in the face of an enemy, and also like shaming or intimidating them without killing them. So here we see Sitting Bull wielding the flag as a coup stick, and by weaponizing the flag in this way, he's absorbed the power inherent to the flag and strengthened his own military superiority. And the other work that I showed you on the previous slide was a ledger drawing of the Battle of Little Bighorn, or Battle of Greasy Grass, made by Amos Badhart Bull, who is an Oglala Lakota man. And here we see the flag in the hands of enemy soldiers. And I think it's interesting to get a bit of background on the artist, because it gives us a further sense of, how narratives relating to this battle persisted for generations. So Bull was born in 1869, prior to the establishment of the Sioux reservations, the separate reservations, in what is now known as South Dakota. Shortly after he was born in 1874, we know this already, gold was discovered in the region, and it paved the way for protracted disagreements and military confrontations between U.S. forces and the Greater Lakota Nation. To give a bit more background on the Battle of Greasy Grass, George Custer led a military battalion to attack a peaceful camp of Cheyenne, Arapaho, and Lakota peoples. And Custer was killed in battle. And this was a historical event of great significance because it took place on the centennial anniversary of the founding of the United States. And this defeat was hugely embarrassing for the nation, who believed themselves as invincible in their bold expropriation of land and the subjugation of its people. The event spurred retaliatory actions and legislation that further limited Native American sovereignty and independence. And Amos Badhart Bull was a child when this happened. So here we see him drawing on the recollections of his father and uncles who had participated in the battle. And by doing that, he created a series of ledger drawings depicting the events surrounding the Battle of Greasy Grass. And those often served as a mnemonic of sorts and were completed with oral histories. This is an imagined scene in which Crazy Horse and Sitting Bull, both of them are named on there, stare down their adversaries on the battlefield prior to the most decisive Native victory in the Plains War period. And in the center of the drawing, there is a Lakota text, which translates to "long hair came with a challenge," and long hair refers to Custer. And I find it really interesting that most of the text throughout this whole ledger book is written in English. However, the core message of this work, that the battle was brought by white aggression, is written here in Lakota. This denies those without language skills the opportunity to fully understand what the Lakota members' understanding of the event was. So one other element that I think is interesting is the fact that the Lakota people are depicted on the right. In an article, Candace Green provided an analysis of Cheyenne ledger drawings, and she claims that the right side is possessed of greater energy or spiritual force and thus dominates the left. And further, around 45% of Cheyenne drawings included in her analysis depicted action flowing towards the center. And the Lakota and Cheyenne tribes are separate, but they were very, very close allies. There was lots of intermarriage. So it makes sense to draw the same conclusion with this work here. And the work was likely created between 1890 and 1913, but probably on the earlier side of that date frame, because this is at the front of the ledger book that Amos Badhart Bull created. And eventually, though it was documented and photographed in 1926, it was buried with the artist's sister in 1947. So let's look at another category of objects that have American flags. We often see them on beaded artworks or beaded clothing or attire created for children. And in this case, the flag served a protective purpose. This is especially true in the case of mothers who created beaded outfits for their children. And we'll take a closer look at the photographs in 1 second. But first, I want to consider the boy's vest seen in the center here, along with the boots and pants seen here. So during the height of the Reservation Period, which ran from about 1880 to 1920, mothers adorned their children's clothing with stars and stripes to mark them as American. These lavishly beaded items of clothing demonstrated both motherly adoration and artistic achievement. Lakota women transformed typical settler attire like vests and cowboy boots to better conform to Native aesthetics by beading them. And while the beadwork style communicated the children's Lakota background, the patriotic imagery on the pieces attempted to both protect the children against negative attention and affirm their emerging American identity. The Lakota were forced to sacrifice their nomadic way of life and adapt to conditions on the reservation. Women were able to assert and preserve their native identity through beadwork. Here's that picture we saw just a second ago, and here we see the Lakota child has a small American flag on his shoulder. And I just love this photograph here. This is a mother with her 3 children, and several of their items of clothing have flags on them. And we also see who I am assuming is her daughter holding her own baby, a Victorian doll, in a cradle board, also with a flag on it. So we didn't have the same cradle board in the exhibition, but we had a similar one that was sort of made for a doll sized and made for play. And it's so interesting to think about, she is emulating her mother's behavior by clothing her baby and protecting her baby with the flag. So one other thing I just want to note is that these artworks a lot of times reflect an important transition in material culture and modes of making. So prior to the introduction of beads through trade with white people, generations of Lakota women had participated in artistic guilds that adorned items, like this bag here with dyed porcupine quills. By the 1840s, though, quill work designs began to recede in popularity as women gained access to brilliant colored seed beads and steel needles. And this emergent art form really took off when women were forced onto the reservation. During the reservation period, there was a common joke that Lakota women would fully bead anything that would stay still. And so while the pouch on the left shows both quill work and beadwork around the rim, the boy's vest is a spectacular example of a fully beaded object. And another spectacular example that wasn't in the show, but I just want to show you here, is this beaded valise by the Lakota artist Nellie Two Bear Gates, who is a famed beadworker. And she crafted this for her daughter Josephine upon graduation from the Carlisle Indian School. On one side, seen on the left, we see a depiction of her family's activities in the Battle of Whitestone Hill, which took place in 1863, during which General Sully destroyed a Sioux village after an uprising in Minnesota. And Nellie Two Bears Gates' father, who was a chief, offered his 2 sons, her brother and himself, and as hostages in exchange for the safety of the village's inhabitants. And the other side of the valise is thought to be Nellie's husband, Frank, who served as one of the guides on her tribe's last major buffalo hunt that took place in 1882. The edges have traditional geometric designs, but we also see a flag peeking out on both sides. And embedded here in the beads here, we see a mother's wish for her daughter to both remember her roots and embrace elements of a Euro-American lifestyle. And this also drives home in another important transition in Lakota women's art making. Prior to life on the reservation, women seldom, if ever, created works with pictographic imagery. But in that time, we did see them work together with male artists to create narrative and figurative imagery on shields or on, teepee liners. So while men would have made the drawings, women sometimes would bead over it. But here we see a woman just working on her own, creating inventive beadwork designs. And then that brings me to the final reason that explored in the show to explain why Lakota people would use the flag in their artwork. And that was to disguise forbidden cultural practices. As I mentioned before, the US government banned many ceremonies, and that included the sun dance in 1882. And that in particular was a devastating loss for the Lakota. However, the time of year the annual Sundance gathering normally took place conveniently coincided with the 4th of July. So the Lakota people co-opted the 4th of July holiday to serve their own purposes. They used a profusion of American flags to disguise traditional cultural activities that were normally banned, including dances, puberty ceremonies, and giveaways in which wealthier Lakota people provided goods for the needy. On the right, we have another ledger drawing by Amos Badhart Bull. And on the left, we have a horse mask that would have been worn by a horse during a parade. And one question that I got that I thought was so interesting when this show was up was, why is the flag backwards here? And sadly, we can never know for sure because we don't know who the maker was. We can't ask them. And ultimately, ethnographers who were collecting this sort of art didn't speak to female makers. So we don't have like a really robust written history providing the perspective of beadworkers. However, there is a convention of displaying the flag incorrectly. In their article, Fluidity of Meaning, Flag Imagery in Plains Indian Art, scholars Douglas Schmidtau and Michael Logan discussed a pair of beaded moccasins that had a flag upside down and at half mast. And they claimed that given the fairly common occurrence of inverted flags in Lakota beaded art, one thing remains certain. Such depictions arose not by accident or careless error, as some contemporary writers have claimed for items attributed to other tribes. So in this case, I like to imagine like this horse walking in a parade. And if he had a flag flowing above his head, this is the orientation that the flag would be in as he was walking forward. So perhaps it related to that, or perhaps it had some more subversive message embedded in it. We can never know for sure, but it's interesting to explore the ideas. So just to give a bit more context on the 4th of July, these celebrations were multi-day events in which hundreds, if not thousands, of natives would all arrive to camp together and participate in a variety of activities from July 1st to July 6th. On the first, natives would come and gather, and there would be giveaways. On the second, there would be traditional dances, and the camp would hold performances that imitated scouting that historically took place during wartime. On July 3rd, previously prohibited ceremonies and dances were allowed to take place that included puberty and adoption ceremonies that were couched as dances, but were actually much more culturally significant than the word dance seems to imply. On 4th of July itself, quote, civilizing activities took place, and that would include church service and events in which the Declaration of Independence was read aloud in both English and Lakota, and we see an image of such a reading on the left there. On July 5th, that would be the parade day, where officers in regalia and the financial hosts for the event would lead the charge and give away items. And it would also include men in regalia, like the beaded vest we see on the right, and cowboy boots, and women in their finest attire. And then the final day was July 6th, where there was often a drill by Indian police, followed by a sham battle that might reenact events like Custer's Last Stand. And all of these activities, in combination with the preponderance of of clothing and other household goods, placated white reservation agents and encouraged them to relax their control. As with many powerful symbols, the message of the flag is communicated in a single glance, but that message is different for different viewers. Imagine you're a white government agent witnessing a blossoming of American flags on July 4th on the Lakota reservation. The natural conclusion you might draw is that this is a symbol of your success. You've turned your enemy into your faithful, enthusiastic, and even patriotic ward, and the ideas for which the flag stands have won on their merits. But those ideas were very different for the Lakota. Rather than a symbol of their domination, the American flag was an emblem of their resistance. And that was a message that was legible to only those who knew how to read it. And that brings me to a concept that defines Native experience today. This is going to be a familiar word to many of you, survivance. It's a term put forward by the Native scholar Gerald Visner, who defines it as an active sense of presence, the continuance of Native stories, not a mere reaction or survivable name. Native survivance stories are renunciations of dominance, tragedy, and victimry. We see the Lakota beadwork we see this at play in the Lakota beadwork of the late 19th century. In the wake of unimaginable tragedy, the Lakota people rejected victimhood. Instead, they embraced the visual symbol of their oppressors to create new possibilities for themselves. So that's my talk. And I'm going to actually, we have time for Q&A now, so I'm going to stop the share. And I think, Kat, you are the person that will be moderating this.
Yeah, thank you so much for that incredibly informative and moving and interesting presentation. I imagine we will definitely have questions. So please, for any attendees who are interested in sharing a question, there's a Q&A opened, not the chat, but the Q&A. So please post, and we will be very pleased to ask Dare to speak to some of your thoughts and your questions. I'll start it off just from a little bit of a different direction, knowing that this programming comes out of the Kupferberg Holocaust Center and also out of our Gallery Museum Studies program. So we have a lot of student attendees who I know are enthralled by the work you're doing and would love to know how you came to do this work. So would you be willing to speak to either like a little bit about your career path and or a little bit your path to this exhibition, to developing this exhibition?
Yeah. So just briefly, I would say for developing the exhibition, I'm an object person. Like I studied material culture rather than art history. So I want to go where the object tells me to go. So one of my favorite things with my job is actually walking around our vaults and seeing what objects catch my attention and see which ones like are asking to be put on view or asking for more research to happen. That's also sort of what brought me to the Arctic Artistry Show. I was looking for objects that haven't been on view in a long time, whose stories may not be known. So I'm very object focused when I'm thinking through narratives. In terms of career path, I studied literature in undergrad, but worked at museums while I worked at the Cantor Art Center while at Stanford. I worked at Yellowstone National Park's collection also while I was an undergrad. And again, all of those were just like great little tastes of different areas of the field. So I did events, I did registration, so like object care, I worked in archives. Then I left the field for a while and came back to pursue a master's degree. And my master's degree, I studied material culture, and I split my time between medieval art, which is what I had been exposed to in undergrad, and native art at Bard Graduate Center. So that was a great sort of taste of, again, this object-focused sort of research. And being in New York, you're just around all of these amazing museums. You get to see all the amazing shows and feel so much inspiration. And my program allowed me to write catalog essays and work on shows at the Bard Graduate Center. So it gave me a lot of practical experience and networking experience that I was able to eventually leverage into a job at the BMA. And I started off as a curatorial assistant, and I'm really privileged to work in an institution where you didn't need to be a curator to curate a show. So I started working on the Stripes and Stars shows while I was still a curatorial assistant. But before that show went up, I became a curator. So it's kind of a circuitous path that brought me to that work.
Thank you so much. I think that's very helpful to hear, because there's all different paths that lead to curatorial work, and yours is definitely an interesting one to hear about. So we're starting to get some Q&A, some questions from the audience. And we'll kind of try to tie some of these together. So a lot of the work that you do is around decolonizing design, which I think we've been thinking since 2012, Amy Lone Tree's book, Decolonizing Museums, came out. Museums more and more and more have been talking about what it means to decolonize, or we've had other speakers in the series talking about re-indigenize. And a student asked about what museums can do to decolonize their spaces and their collections. I think that's a huge question. So maybe
that's a huge question.
I want to talk a little bit about what decolonized design means in terms of what you do, or if you want to speak to one aspect of decolonizing museums.
Yeah. So I taught a class called Decolonizing Design at MICA. And essentially our hypothesis or our definition of decolonize is not as radical as certain people's in the field. Some people in the field say decolonize only means giving land back. And there's a good case to be made for that. I like the flexibility of the term and that it points to a lot of different possible futures. So when I'm thinking decolonize, I'm thinking, how can we unwind evidence or move away from the colonial roots of a certain system? So in graphic design, how can we break from colonial norms? Within encyclopedic museums, how can we work against some of our colonial impulses or the colonial foundation that we were built on? How can we resist? We're never going to achieve a fully decolonized reality. That can't happen. Colonialism is far too deeply rooted in our day-to-day existence, but we can still make really important moves towards decolonization. So one thing that we're doing at the BMA is making sure that community members have access to objects. So we collect ethically. When things aren't supposed to be in our collection, they go back to the source communities that they belong with. And that's something we're very committed to. And also, even if source communities don't want these objects back, maybe they want access to it, or maybe they want to be able to talk to a curator about these objects or how to best care for them when they're in the museum building. So I think that can be a radical decolonial action, as well as making it clear that we're not the only owners of an object. Rather, these belong to a culture and we can be stewards of them. We're working on a big 2024 show that's thinking about how to realize a decolonial museum or anti-colonial museum. And so with that, we're thinking about, bringing a bunch of contemporary artists into our space and all gathering together and brainstorming together and thinking about what stories need to be told. How can we make the museum a place where Native people feel welcome? That would be a radical act, because a lot of Native people do not feel welcome in museums. So we're slowly but surely kind of picking away at these colonial roots to hopefully arrive at a more beautiful future. And hopefully that's answered your question. But if you have a follow-up question, I would be happy to offer further insight.
You covered so much there. Thank you so much. And I will suggest to folks who are here, and I'm sorry, that's my dog in the background, that there's some great programs in this Human Rights Museum series that are previously recorded, one with Jackie Swift that deals with repatriation in the context of the of the institution where she works, and then also another program where a number of other programs that touched on other aspects of what Dare has been speaking about today. We have one other question that is kind of broad, but certainly something that I think also Dr. Laura Cohen brought up in her introduction, this idea that there are many, many Native names associated with different institutions and businesses and streets we live on and places that we go. And, how do we think about that in relationship to the history of these places? So if I know it's a little outside of some of the talk, but it certainly might connect with some of the things you talked about, or you were focused on the exhibition regionally in terms of Lakota people or Lakota regions.
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think I read a really shockingly high statistic of how many street names and how many towns and how many rivers are named after Native American groups or Native American terms, and it is really high. So I think that's an element of sort of, in a way, theft, because these were Native concepts. The Native people had the name for this river, and that was stolen by white settlers to either maybe name the river or maybe name a bank. I think that it's something that's really ubiquitous. And I encourage you all to look for it. When you're driving, do you notice place names that maybe stick out to you as, oh, maybe that there's some Native roots there? When you start looking for it, you see it a lot more. But that is a great question.
And I think your background, Land Back, speaks to this question as well, very clearly. So I think that we are actually getting very close to the end of our program. So Dare, I want to thank you again for the incredible presentation, and send the Zoom back to Laura to close our program today. Thank you.
Thanks,
you.
Kat. And Dare, I'm just in awe. I have to say, this was as much a history lesson today as it was an a conceptual art discussion. And I was like thinking about, you talked about the sort of the three uses of the American flag: military might, protecting Lakota loved ones, and disguising forbidden cultural practices. And I'm curious because when we launched the Turtle Island exhibit at the KHC, we have three distinct communities: older Jewish community members. We have students from QCC and faculty from QCC, and we had a very mixed response from the community. And I was very taken again with so much of the history that you're talking about, even before you could even talk about the art. And I wanted to ask sort of, how was the show received, and what's it like to be for you to be in that place where you're educating people about the history as much as about the show that you put together?
Yeah, so I was like thrilled that the show could happen at all, because this was 2020 when everything was getting cut. And, I was worried that our loans weren't going to come through. The beautiful horse mask was coming from upstate New York, as well as a few other objects. So I was super thankful that the show could happen at all. And I would say it was really well received by the BMA community. We had multiple events where we were able to bring in Lakota people, one particular beadworker and activist who was able to offer additional insight into the works. And to me, that's something that I always strive for with any exhibition, is making sure that we understand these things happened in history, but these people still exist today, and they have a very vibrant community. So I think anytime we're talking about, Native art, I love history, and I want to take that opportunity to educate people. And it's a careful balance. You only have so many words you can write into any exhibition. So are there ways to pressure that and expand that? And one way we did with this show to make sure that we could point to, many different moments in history is having audio tour stops where a Lakota singer would sing a traditional song, and you could hear that and you could experience that while looking at the art. So I think it's all, careful balance. You want to inform and educate people without boring them. And all of that's done with a tight choreography of word count. So for those of you who become curators one day, you're going to have to learn how to be very succinct and say things, long book stories in like 80 words. So that was a really interesting challenge anytime you're doing an exhibition.
It definitely came up, and Kat did such a brilliant job in working with the different artists and students who wrote this text. Because for the Turtle Island exhibition, we also spent, like using my hands, how do you also connect so many of the atrocities and practices of erasure that happen not only to Native American people here, but also the connections to the Holocaust? And I want to point out that we spent a lot of time working with our docents to help communicate this. And right now, actually, there's a brand new Ken Burns documentary on America and the Holocaust. And the first episode is absolutely about debunking some of the myths about the Holocaust, which is that all of these ideas were Hitler and the Nazis alone. And in fact, that's not the case. We know very much from history that Hitler was, he was a student of history, of American history, and a lot of the practices were taken based on what the American government did to Native American people, and the same with the brutality of Jim Crow. Thank you so much. I know our students, looking at the participants who are here, many of them are students. We're really, really grateful for you sharing all of your expertise with us today, and really kind of bringing together sort of seamlessly talking about art, talking about culture, talking about human rights. And thank you all for watching today. On behalf of the Kupferberg Holocaust Center, we're really grateful that you're here. We hope you all stay safe and well, and please check us out on YouTube. You can find more of the programs in the museum and the Human Rights series. Thanks, everyone. Be well.